Colombia, I had the opportunity to go to East Africa on a trip to Somaliland, Kenya, and Djibouti. We visited the Ali Ali refugee camp outside of Djibouti city, and then we went into Djibouti city. The capital of Djibouti is Djibouti. And we had the opportunity to meet some refugees in Djibouti. We went to Somaliland, a country that's not quite a country, and we had a chance to talk to some Somaliland IDPs. Following that, I went more close to this part of the world, to Myanmar or Burma, and I had the opportunity to look at some of the international community's response in the aftermath of Cyclone Nargis, to determine whether or not there was a way for well-meaning international community endeavors to provide assistance to those unfortunate Burmese who are suffering from the effects of both their government and their cyclone. By virtue of all these experiences, here's people fishing, by virtue of all these experiences, I was encouraged and lucky enough to get the Rotary Fellowship. And I came here, and I was encouraged, again, by someone else I was speaking to about this, to give a presentation on what have I learned. And I'm not going to go over, as Masa did, what have we learned in the context of all our classes. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what have I learned over the course of my entire experience. We'll start with something that I learned from my good friend here. There's a very trite book called The Tao of Pooh, which quotes frequently from a very wise book called The Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. And right at the beginning of the book, there's a little exchange between Pooh and Piglet. And Piglet says to Pooh, "Pooh, when you wake up first thing in the morning, what do you think about?" And Pooh says, "I wonder what's for lunch." And then Pooh says to Piglet, "Piglet, when you wake up in the morning, what's the first thing you think about?" And Piglet says, "I think about, I wonder what exciting thing is going to happen to me today." And Pooh takes a moment and says, "Yeah, same thing," right? And the story I read this like years ago, and it's always stuck with me for a number of reasons. One, I love lunch. Two, it sort of gets to the same general principle that I'm trying to talk on today about how we sometimes confuse things with qualification. We try to make things more complex than they seem. We put titles and associations with events or individuals that are much more complex than they might be. So what else have I learned? Well, I've learned in UQ, like as a Jew, I answer questions with questions, right? So instead of saying what have I learned, I'm going to say who have I learned from. So I've had the pleasure to tutor for 2 semesters here, and I'm quite touched that some of my undergraduate students are actually here today, and I've learned quite a lot from them over the course of this semester. The students here at UQ are extremely thoughtful, even at an undergraduate level. But I've also learned from suits. This is the second time I've worn this suit since I've been here. The last time was this seminar last year. I've learned that I've actually, despite the mayor's protestations otherwise, lost weight because the suit doesn't fit me quite right anymore. I've learned a lot from the people that I've shared the Rotary Fellowship experience with. I learned about personal courage and commitment from Yuka. She's too modest to tell you, but she did not speak English prior to coming to UQ, and came here about 2 months ahead of time and studied English. And knowing how hard I struggle with writing papers, to think that Yuka is capable of completing a master's degree, given the language barrier, is quite dramatic. I've learned about perseverance from Humera. We heard about her unfortunate incident coming from her fellowship interview. I've learned a lot from Joe. I was really disappointed we didn't get the opportunity as a group to look at Joe's comics. I was able to use Joe's comics to give a lecture about the Israeli-Palestinian crisis because they're that good, they're that sharp. I also learned something very interesting from Joe in terms of general modesty. I did my AFE, my applied field experience, in Tel Aviv, and Joe was in Ramallah where he had worked for 3 years. Now, to his credit, in addition to going back to Ramallah to do his own AFE, Joe managed to rope, 6 other students from UQ to go and volunteer and do internships in Ramallah. So I went to visit them, and he was kind enough to host me. And I got an opportunity, having lived in Israel in my youth, to actually go to parts of Palestine that I'd never been before. It was my first time to Ramallah, and I also went to Jenin with them. But you go into Ramallah, and the guy is like the mayor, right? It's like cheers. Everywhere you go, people know Joe's name, right? And it's particularly in the bar, but in the street and in the education. It's really amazing. And knowing him as a bartender here, as my classmate, you would never know this, but the guy is like doing wonderful, wonderful work in Ramallah. I've also learned from my classmates and my educators. In Dr. Martin Weber's Culture, Conflict, and Reconciliation course, one student shared an experience she had while doing an internship in Southeast Asia about scheduling a meeting for 11 o'clock after the rain, right? In that culture, right, you set meetings for time, but you also are cognizant of the geographical and meteorological conditions, and so you basically deal with that. And she told the experience of how that made it very difficult to determine if it was still raining, whether or not the meeting was on. And has explored this concept of time in the context of peace building, right? How does the international community's peace building efforts, which are based on a Western conception of time, how do they relate to communities and cultures where time has a very different meaning? History, the past is still the present. And I've thought about this in the context of my own master's research, right? Where I'm doing my research, my thesis, poorly with the help of Dr. Sebastian Kemp, who I'm sorry isn't here right now, on the concept of war crimes and atrocities committed over the course of war. And we have, what I've discovered is that the premise that I'm doing the paper on is as an advocate for the protection of civilians, how do I most effectively tell warring parties not to kill people, not to kill innocent people? And the problem is, that I've discovered, with Seb's help, is that while the international community has come up with all these war crimes and definitions and legal terms, what they've essentially done is, A, created a system that is predicated on a Western conception, right? They've taken what one scholar calls complex moral issues and turned them into legal ones. And they've also tried to impose on people who are incapable of abiding by those laws the set of standards that we expect from them. And it touches back onto this same notion, right? We call horrible acts of violence war crimes, or we use all sorts of legal terms to describe things that you just shouldn't do. In the same way that when we deal with refugees, we ascribe this particular terminology in terms of so that we have a sense of what our responsibility is, when we really should just help, right? So part of my research has been looking at a couple of contemporary conflicts. You have the United States engaged in a global war on terror, right? So Al-Qaeda, for all their terrible things, cannot abide by laws of war if they are going to be engaged in combat with the United States. It's unfeasible, it's untenable. Meanwhile, the United States, when combating Al-Qaeda, comes up with all these legal loopholes to get around laws of war. Similarly, I've looked at the situation in Sri Lanka, right, where the Tamil Tigers were engaged in a civil war with the government of Sri Lanka. Neither side, for various reasons, was capable of abiding by or responding to the laws of war. And so, I guess at the end, it leaves us with the question of, just want to make sure I'm not breaking any slides. Yeah. Right? So these complex legal matters, right? And okay, right. So then what next, right? What do we do now, right? If the laws of war aren't helping us, right? Then what are we supposed to do? I don't know. I'm not here to provide an answer. However, taking it back to the refugees, because I'm constantly asked when talking to Rotary clubs about refugees, what should we do? Well, for starters, remember that refugees, while they might have political status or this legal status, are functionally humans, right? And so when you have this debate in Australia about what to do with our refugee and asylum policy, I'm just going to preempt the question, right? Like, let's get away from this discussion of them that's predicated on labels, right? They're not boat people, they're people, right? They're people who are suffering or who have suffered, who are making very, very difficult decisions because they want to live the same basic lives and have the same basic privileges that we have, right? So no, I'm not going to give an answer telling you what to do about your overall refugee policy. What I will suggest is that as you think about it as individuals, you that we take the time to step back and think, why are people making these decisions? What circumstances do they have? And try to reflect back on their basic humanity and not necessarily on the political status or the legal status associated with their particular endeavor. I would be remiss if I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment to just say thank you to a number of people, including my counselors, Caroline and Carrie, and all the Rotarians who have provided me the funding for their fellowship, but also I'd really like to show some pictures. Oh, right. I'd like to show some pictures of my family. Before I do so, though, I just want to point out this particular slide, which was up there somewhere before. The Association Quran is an association of Djiboutian women based in Djibouti City, which is an extremely poor place. And they discovered one day that there were Somali women living in the ravine running outside the city. And with no sense of their legal responsibility as Djiboutians for refugees, the women got together, formed an association, and pooled their very, very limited resources to take care of other people who needed help. And it hit home on this point of, you don't need a convention to tell you what to do when someone is suffering. You just need to help. At this point, I'd just like to show pictures of my family, because I wouldn't be here without their help. My parents in the corner, my brother and sister-in-law, Stephanie, Lucy and David, my niece, Molly, my other niece, Gabriella, and my nephews, Jesse and Noah. And then also a special thank you, because a lot of them are here today and have made the experience particularly special. Brisbane's finest, some of my close friends here who have made this experience really quite wonderful. So thank you very much. If you have any questions.